My fiancé vanished into the arms of his high school sweetheart just weeks before our wedding. Now, he was pounding on my door at midnight, screaming that she was pregnant with another man's child. The pounding started at exactly 12:14 a.m. I remember the time because I was sitting on my living room floor, staring at my phone in the dark when it began. 3 knocks, then 5, then the sound of a fist hitting the door. "Claire, I know you're in there." I didn't move. I sat with my back against the couch, my knees pulled to my chest, staring at the door as if it might suddenly grow teeth. "I have proof," Ethan said, his voice cracking through the wood. "Please, just look at it." My phone buzzed in my hand. The same message had been sitting there for 11 minutes. Asterisk asterisk, she's pregnant, but I don't think the baby is mine. The timing doesn't add up. Unless she was already pregnant when she messaged me first. Asterisk asterisk, I read it again. Then a third time. Each time, it seemed to mean something different, and none of those meanings made me want to open the door. "Claire, come on. The neighbors are going to call the cops." Asterisk good, asterisk I thought. Asterisk let them. Asterisk he kept talking, but his voice became quieter, as if he had finally remembered that other people had walls too. "You have to understand what she did to me. What she did to us. I need you to see this." I thought about the wedding dress hanging in my closet, still wrapped in plastic from the boutique. I thought about the barn we'd booked in Golden. The $4,200 deposit sitting in a vendor's account, non-refundable, already spent on somebody else's version of my wedding day. 6 weeks ago, I had a fiancé. Tonight, I had a stranger sobbing outside my door about a baby that might not be his. "Ethan," I finally said, standing close enough to the door for him to hear me without opening it. "Go home." "I don't have a home. That's the whole point. You're it. You've always been it." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I picked up my phone and did the only thing that made sense at 12:19 in the morning while the man I used to love was falling apart 6 feet from my face. I called his sister. It hadn't always been like this. 3 years earlier, Ethan Mercer had been the easiest person I'd ever loved. We met at a barbecue in Washington Park, both of us hiding from a game of cornhole neither of us wanted to play. He made me laugh so hard I nearly choked on a rib bone. I was 26 then, working long shifts as a physical therapist at Foothills Rehab Center. It was the kind of job that left you exhausted in a very specific way because you spent all day dealing with other people's pain. Ethan was 28 and worked in marketing for a software company called Vantage Analytics. He was steady, funny, reliable, the kind of man my mother had stopped believing existed. After a year, we moved into a 2-bedroom apartment at Cherry Creek Lofts, Unit 4C. The balcony was too small for furniture, and the view was nothing more than a parking garage we pretended was charming. Then he proposed at Red Rocks Amphitheater on a Tuesday in March. There was no crowd and no big production, just the two of us and a park ranger who clapped for us from a distance. He had driven us there pretending we were going on a sunset hike. I remember being annoyed because we'd picked a weeknight. I was exhausted after a full day of work and distracted during the entire drive up the canyon. Then Ethan got down on one knee on the same stone step where we'd once sat and shared a gas station sandwich on our third date. He was shaking so badly that he dropped the ring box once before getting the question out. The ring cost $6,200, more than either of us should have spent. I wore it like it meant something permanent. We called his parents from the car on the way home, both of us talking over each other. I still remember Carol crying so loudly over the speakerphone that Ethan had to pull the phone away from his ear. He was laughing, happier than I had ever heard him. Sometimes I remember that drive home, not because I miss Ethan exactly, but because I need to remember that the happiness was real. I wasn't imagining that part. Whatever fell apart later, that joy had been real. His family welcomed me immediately. His grandmother, Eleanor, was 74 and sharper than anyone I'd ever met. She taught me how to knit on Saturday afternoons in her kitchen in Golden. My own mother had died when I was 22, and Eleanor never said it directly, but somehow she filled a little of that empty space without either of us ever having to name it. Ethan's mother, Carol, sent me recipes. His younger sister, Mia, was a labor and delivery nurse, and she became one of my closest friends. Back then, I truly believed I was going to be part of their family forever. I had no idea that 6 weeks before my wedding, Ethan would leave me for the woman he'd loved in high school, and that weeks later, he'd be standing outside my door, desperate for me to believe that the baby she was carrying wasn't his. Mia became the closest thing I had to a sister of my own. About 18 months into our relationship, I got to see exactly what Ethan was capable of. That memory is part of why the last 2 months have been so difficult for me to reconcile with the man I thought I knew. I herniated a disc at work after lifting a patient the wrong way. It was a stupid, common injury, but it left me flat on my back for 6 weeks and furious at my own body in a way I'd never experienced before. Ethan completely rearranged his schedule without me even asking. He drove me to physical therapy appointments at a clinic that wasn't even his own. He sat in waiting rooms with his laptop, doing his actual job so he wouldn't fall behind. He learned to cook the 3 meals I could tolerate without triggering nausea from the muscle relaxants. He never once made me feel like a burden. Not even on the nights when I cried out of frustration instead of pain. Eleanor still brings up that period sometimes, even now, as if it's evidence in a case she's still trying to understand herself. He was so good to you that year, she once told me, months before any of this happened. She had no idea she was building a case both of us would later need to lean on. Back then, I believed that a man who showed up for me during the worst 6 weeks of my adult life had shown me the truest version of himself. I still don't completely know how to reconcile that belief with what happened later. Maybe both things were true. Maybe Ethan really was that person. But there was something else inside him, something older, something that had been quietly waiting since 9th grade, that finally won when an easier option appeared. There had been one strange moment early in our relationship that I didn't think about again until much later. We'd been together for about 8 months, lying in bed and swapping old relationship stories the way new couples do. He told me about Vanessa Cole. 7 years, he said. Started in 9th grade at Boulder High and ended the summer before college scattered us to different states. We just never got a real ending. He stared at the ceiling. No fight. No cheating. We just drifted. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't. At the time, I thought it was sweet in a wistful sort of way. Everyone has a Vanessa. I didn't think it was a warning. There was another moment, too. Smaller, easier to dismiss. About a year into our relationship, we had a stupid argument over something I can't even remember now. Dishes, plans, something meaningless. In the middle of it, Ethan said, Vanessa would never have made this into a fight. He apologized within an hour. I forgave him by the next day. I filed it away as nothing. The way you file away most things that later turn out to be everything. For 2.5 years, none of it mattered. We built a life that felt solid enough to build a wedding on top of. Our venue was booked for June 21st at a barn outside Golden. My dress had been bought in February from a boutique called Bella Rosa. It cost $2,150 and had been tailored to fit a version of me that hadn't been humiliated yet. The caterer was paid. The photographer was paid. Eleanor was going to walk me halfway down the aisle because my own father wasn't speaking to me. We'd agreed on the arrangement with tears in both our eyes. Then, in March, an email arrived. Ethan showed me his phone at the kitchen table, smiling in a way I now recognize as nervous rather than casual. My high school ex wants to catch up, he said. Vanessa. Weird, right? Haven't heard from her in like 12 years. Go, I told him. Have coffee. Catch up. And I meant it. I want that on the record. Even now, I trusted him enough to hand him the rope myself. He came back from that coffee a different person, and the change happened faster than I could understand. For 3 weeks, dinner became quiet. His phone, which used to sit face up on the counter, started going face down the moment I entered a room. When I hugged him after work, the same way I had every day for 3 years, he flinched like I'd pressed on a bruise. What's wrong? I asked him more than once. Nothing. Just work stress, he said, looking somewhere over my shoulder. I believed him because I wanted to. That's its own kind of shame when I look back. Not that I was lied to, but how easy the lie was to accept. Then, on a Saturday in April, I went to Eleanor's house for our usual knitting afternoon, a tradition we'd had almost since the beginning. When I came home 2 hours later, Ethan was packing duffel bags on our bed. His work laptop was already zipped into its case. His friend Dale from Vantage was outside loading boxes into a pickup truck like they'd rehearsed the entire thing. I'm sorry, Ethan said without looking at me. Seeing Vanessa again. I realized what I lost. He paused. It's comfortable. It's not real. Not like what we had. 3 weeks, I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. You're throwing away 3 years for 3 weeks. I've known her since I was 15, he said, as though that explained everything. You can't compete with that kind of history. I stood in the bedroom doorway holding a half-finished scarf I'd been knitting for him. The yarn was still looped around my fingers while Dale carried out a box of Ethan's records like it was any other Saturday. Ethan didn't look at me once as he walked toward the door. He looked at the boxes. He looked at his phone. But he never looked at me. I barely ate for 2 weeks afterward. I slept on the couch because the bed still smelled like him, and I couldn't stand being surrounded by the memory. But then something happened that I hadn't expected. Something that would eventually matter far more than I realized at the time. Eleanor's family didn't disappear with him. Eleanor called me every single day, furious at her own grandson in a way that somehow made me love her even more. Carol sent apology after apology, as if she could personally make up for her son's decisions. Mia called Vanessa poison the very first night and told me she'd disappear the moment the thrill wore off. She was right. It just took 3 weeks to prove it. Ethan called me on a Tuesday night, and his voice was already cracking before I'd even said hello. I made a mistake, he said. The biggest mistake of my entire life. She's a stranger, he continued, the words spilling out so quickly it sounded like he'd rehearsed them in the car. She makes fun of my job. She threw out half my clothes because they didn't fit her aesthetic. I miss you. I miss someone who actually knows me, not some fantasy from high school. You left me for a memory, I said flatly. It was the truest thing I could think of. I know. God, I know. Please, can we talk? I'm outside right now. My blood went cold. I hadn't given him permission to know where outside even meant anymore. I looked through the window. His car was parked crooked across 2 spaces, headlights off. Ethan stood beside it in the rain, looking like he was starring in a movie only he could see. Leave. I texted him. Or I'm calling the police. My name is still on that lease, too. You wouldn't. Try me. I typed back. I hit send before I could talk myself out of it. His next message came 4 minutes later. It was the message that changed the entire shape of that night. She's pregnant, but I don't think the baby is mine. The timing doesn't add up unless she was already pregnant when she messaged me first. I didn't answer. I turned off every light in the apartment and sat on the floor with my back against the couch, my phone buzzing repeatedly against the hardwood. And that's exactly where this story began. 12:14 in the morning. Ethan pounding on a door I'd already decided, somewhere underneath all the shock. I was never going to open for him again. Except I wasn't going to face that moment alone. While his fist was still hitting the door, I called Mia. She answered on the second ring, already half awake and furious before I'd even finished explaining. Ethan is at your apartment right now, banging on the door, she asked. He says he has proof about something. Don't open it. I heard her moving around, grabbing her keys and waking up her boyfriend. I'm calling him. Do not open that door, Claire. I mean it. I didn't. A few minutes later, I heard Mia's voice faintly from the hallway. Sharp and clipped. She was talking to Ethan about harassment, restraining orders, and what their grandmother would think when she found out exactly what he was doing at midnight outside his ex-fiancée's apartment. His footsteps eventually retreated. Then his engine started too quickly. His tires screeched against the wet pavement as he peeled out of the parking lot. I sat there for another 20 minutes before I trusted the silence enough to move. The next morning, I called my landlord before I'd even finished my coffee. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the locks on Unit 4C had been changed. I stood in my own hallway, running my thumb over a brass key that no longer fit any lock Ethan Mercer had ever touched. That evening, I heard it anyway. His key sliding into the deadbolt. Turning. Catching on nothing. He jiggled it harder, as if force alone could somehow undo the last 24 hours. Then his hand went flat against the door. His voice came next, quieter than I expected. Almost confused. Like the lock itself had personally betrayed him. Claire. He tried the key again. Claire, the key isn't working. I didn't answer. I stood in my kitchen with a dish towel in my hand and let the silence answer for me. The calls started 10 minutes later. 10 of them, back to back. I watched every single one go to voicemail without touching the phone. Then, for 2 days, there was nothing. I told myself it was over. I told myself the worst part had already happened. Now I just had to survive the aftermath. The boring, exhausting logistics of unbuilding a life. Canceling vendors. Returning things. Figuring out how to split a lease with someone whose name was still legally attached to the apartment but who no longer had a key. I was wrong about it being over. 2 days later, Ethan came back. This time, he pounded harder. Loud enough that I heard my neighbor's door across the hall crack open, a narrow strip of curious light spilling into the hallway. "Open the door," Ethan shouted. He wasn't even trying to keep his voice down anymore. "Vanessa lied to both of us. I have the messages. I have proof. Just let me show you." My hands were shaking so badly that I typed the wrong number twice while dialing the police non-emergency line. An officer arrived within 20 minutes. The officer remained calm and completely unbothered, like he'd handled this exact situation 100 times before. Ethan pointed toward my window and told him his name was still on the lease, that this was still his home too. Technically, legally, he had a point, but a signature from 4 years ago didn't mean much against a changed lock. The officer made him leave anyway. Before Ethan's car pulled out of the parking lot, he rolled down his window and shouted toward my building loudly enough for half the complex to hear. "She played us both. You're making the biggest mistake of your life." I stepped away from the curtain, my heart pounding against my ribs. And that was the night before the one this story opened with. The night I'm telling you about now. The one where Ethan stood outside in the rain again, his phone glowing in his hand, refusing to leave no matter how many times I asked. His last message was still lit up on my screen. Asterisk asterisk, she's pregnant, and I don't think the baby is mine. I have proof. Please, just look at it. Asterisk asterisk, I hadn't opened the door. I hadn't answered a single message. And I still didn't know, as I stood there in the dark with my phone buzzing against the floor, that the proof he was so desperate to show me wasn't going to break my heart the way he thought it would. It was going to be the thing that finally made everything make sense. But that came later. Before it did, Ethan tried almost everything else. 2 days after the police showed up outside my building, he changed tactics. I found out because Eleanor called me. For the first time since all of this started, her voice wasn't angry. It was tired. "He came by the house," she said. "Sat at my kitchen table and cried for 40 minutes. My stomach dropped. Are you okay?" "I'm fine. I've raised that boy since he was 6 weeks old. Claire, I know the difference between real grief and a performance." She paused, but it was a good performance. He told her I'd changed the locks without warning. He told her I wouldn't even let him explain. He made it sound like I was the one who had blindsided him. I sat down on my kitchen floor, pressing the phone tightly against my ear. "That's not what happened." "I know." Eleanor's voice softened. "I was there for 3 years of dinners, sweetheart. I watched the two of you build something real. But he's good at this. He's always been good at making himself look like the one who got hurt." Her voice hardened again, becoming more like the Eleanor I knew. "I told him that if he came back here trying to use me to get to you, he wouldn't be welcome in this house anymore. He left angry, called me unfair, said I was choosing sides. I'm sorry he put you in that position. Don't apologize for him," she said. "You've spent enough of this relationship apologizing for him. That should have been the end of it." But the next escalation came from a completely different direction. 2 mutual friends from Ethan's college years, people I'd known for years too, started texting me that same week. Separately, but with almost identical wording. It sounded like they'd been coached, or like Ethan had repeated his version of the story so many times that it had turned into a script. Asterisk asterisk is really struggling. Asterisk 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 he knows he messed up. Asterisk 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 maybe you could just hear him out for closure, if nothing else. Asterisk asterisk I gave both of them the same answer. If Ethan wants to talk, he can talk to a lawyer about the lease and a therapist about everything else. I'm not in the business of providing closure to a man who never gave me any. 3 days later, he escalated again. This time, it wasn't guilt. It was fear, or at least a version of fear convincing enough that I almost fell for it. At 11 that night, I received a text. Asterisk asterisk I don't know what I'm going to do if you don't talk to me. I'm not okay, Claire. I mean it. I'm really not okay. Asterisk asterisk my first instinct, the old instinct built over 3 years of loving him, was to call him immediately and make sure he was safe. I didn't ignore that feeling. I'm not that kind of person, and I never wanted to become one. But I also wasn't going to let him back through a door I'd already had rekeyed, physically or emotionally. Instead, I called Mia. She was closer to him than I was willing to be anymore, and I needed someone who could check on him without costing me anything else. She called back 40 minutes later. He's fine, she said flatly. He's sitting in Dale's living room watching a hockey game. I could hear the television in the background the entire time she was talking. Neither of us said the word out loud, but we were both thinking it. Ethan had used the one kind of leverage he had left, the kind built on real fear, the kind you're never supposed to risk being wrong about. And he'd used it as a bargaining chip instead of telling the truth. Something inside me went quiet and cold after that call. Quieter than the locks. Quieter than the police report. I finally understood that every version of Ethan I spoke to from that point forward would be a version designed to get something from me, not a version interested in telling me the truth. But he had one more thing to try. It happened before the messages from our mutual friends and before the almost crisis text. And it made me angrier than anything else he'd done because it reached beyond me entirely. It reached into a group chat I'd been part of for 6 years. Old college friends. People who had watched us get engaged at Red Rocks. People who knew nothing about what had really happened beyond whatever Ethan chose to tell them. Late on a Sunday night, Ethan posted a long message. He carefully framed it as an update rather than a plea, explaining that he and Claire were going through something difficult. Ethan told the group that he still loved me deeply and hoped everyone could hold space for both of us during such a difficult time. There was no mention of Vanessa. No mention of the boxes. No mention of the changed locks or the police showing up 2 nights earlier. He had created a version of events soft enough to make him look like the wounded party in some vague, mutual heartbreak. Around the same time, he tried something I genuinely never expected. And it's the thing that still unsettles me the most when I look back. My father and I hadn't spoken in almost 4 years. We'd fallen out over my mother's estate, and neither of us had handled it with much grace. Ethan knew exactly how raw that wound still was. Somehow, he found my father's number, maybe from an old holiday card, maybe through Eleanor's contacts, and called him directly. He introduced himself as my fiancé and explained whatever version of events he'd convinced himself was true by then. According to him, Claire was refusing to communicate, and he was worried about me. To my father's credit, he called me that same evening. It was the first time we'd spoken in years. His voice was gruff and uncertain over the phone, and hearing it almost made me cry, but for completely different reasons. Some guy named Ethan called me, he said. Said you weren't answering him. Said he was worried. We're not together anymore, Dad. There was a pause. He's not worried. He's trying to find a door I haven't already locked. The silence that followed was the kind I remembered from when we used to talk regularly, when he'd pause because he was carefully choosing his words. I don't know what happened, he finally said. But I know you wouldn't lock a door on somebody without a reason. You want me to do anything about it? No, I said. I just wanted you to know, in case he calls again, that he's not who he's telling you he is. We didn't magically fix 4 years of silence during that one phone call. But we talked twice more that month. They were tentative, careful conversations that had nothing to do with Ethan. Sometimes I've wondered if something good accidentally came out of Ethan's desperation. A door I thought was permanently shut had cracked open slightly, for reasons that had nothing to do with what he intended. Meanwhile, 2 people from that college group chat privately messaged me within an hour. They were confused but gentle, asking if I was okay and whether there was anything they could do. I told them the truth. I didn't exaggerate anything. I told them about the coffee, the 3 weeks, the packed bags, the changed locks, the midnight knocking, the police. After that, I watched the group chat go completely silent for 2 days. It was the particular kind of silence that happens when people are quietly recalibrating who they thought they knew. When the conversation finally started again, nobody mentioned Ethan's post. Someone simply added a friend's baby shower to the calendar. And life, in its small and indifferent way, kept moving around the wreckage Ethan had tried to reshape into something more flattering. Still, one detail slipped through everything. It was small enough that I almost missed it. It came from one of Ethan's rambling voicemails, somewhere between the crying and the pleading. "Vanessa kept blowing me off that first week," he said at one point, almost talking to himself. Said her ex, Marcus, was causing drama and she couldn't really talk. I didn't think much of it. I figured that was just what happened when someone was getting divorced from one life to start another. I didn't think anything of it that night. I filed it away the same way I'd filed away the story about Vanessa years earlier. A detail that seemed meaningless. A detail that would later turn out to mean everything. By the following week, I had a locksmith's invoice, a police incident number, 2 unread voicemails from Ethan's mother that I couldn't bring myself to listen to yet, and a wedding that was still technically scheduled for June 21st. I sat at my kitchen table with the caterer's cancellation policy open on my laptop, trying to figure out how much of our $1,500 deposit we'd get back. Then my phone buzzed. It was a notification from an app one barely used. A direct message request on Instagram. The account wasn't familiar. I didn't open it right away. And I want to be honest about that. It wasn't bravery that made me wait. It was exhaustion. I'd spent 11 straight days being ambushed by the slow-motion collapse of my relationship, and some tired, self-protective part of me needed 1 hour where nothing new could hurt me. So I closed the app and finished the cancellation email to the caterer instead. My hands were steady in a way they hadn't been in almost 2 weeks. Work helped more than I expected it to. Foothills Rehab didn't care that my life had fallen apart. It only cared whether Mr. Alvarez in room 6 could extend his knee 12 more degrees than he could the week before. There was something almost holy about that kind of focus. My co-worker Priya, who had covered 2 of my shifts without even asking why, finally sat me down in the break room on a Thursday. She brought me a coffee and didn't expect me to pay her back. "You don't have to tell me everything," she said, "but you look like you haven't slept since March." "I haven't." "Is he still calling?" "Less. He's just found new people to call instead." I told her about Eleanor, the mutual friends, the almost crisis text, and the hockey game playing in the background during Mia's phone call. Priya listened without interrupting. That silence was its own kind of gift. "He's not falling apart because he lost you," she finally said gently. "He's falling apart because losing you is the first consequence he's ever had to sit with." She paused. "Those aren't the same thing, Claire, even if they look identical from the outside." I didn't have an answer. I still don't know if I fully believed her then, but I kept that sentence with me. The way you keep a spare key because you don't think you'll need it yet. That night, Carol called. For the first time, I answered. Ethan's mother had always been kind to me in a slightly formal, careful way, the kind of kindness that comes from someone determined not to overstep. She didn't defend him. That surprised me more than anything else that week. "I raised him better than this," she said, her voice cracking in a way I'd never heard before. "I don't know what's happening to my son, but I know it isn't your job to fix it. I just wanted you to hear that from me directly, not filtered through anyone else." "Thank you," I said, and I meant it more than those 2 words could express. "He asked me to talk to you, to vouch for him." She paused. I told him no. After we hung up, I sat there with my laptop closed and my tea gone cold. I thought about how strange it was that the people closest to Ethan were slowly becoming the closest thing I had to allies, while Ethan himself became someone I recognized less and less every day. I thought about the barn in Golden, now empty on the calendar except for a cancellation fee. I thought about the dress still hanging in its plastic sleeve. A future I'd tried on in front of a mirror in February had already disappeared. I thought about Vanessa, too, even though I tried not to. I'd built an entire villain out of a woman I'd never met. A name connected to 7 years of Ethan's adolescence and 3 weeks of my own unraveling. I didn't know yet how wrong, and how right, that instinct actually was. A little after 10 that night, I finally opened the Instagram message. I was sitting cross-legged on my bed with the lamp on, half expecting spam and half expecting nothing at all. The account had almost no posts. The profile picture showed a dark-haired man who looked to be in his early 30s, standing in front of what looked like a mountain trailhead. The username was simple, his first name followed by a string of numbers. **** Marcus Delgado _821. The message was only 3 lines long. The moment I read the first line, my entire body went still. It was the feeling you get right before realizing you're about to fall. I'm sorry to message you out of nowhere. My name is Marcus. I was with Vanessa for 2 years until about 6 weeks ago. I think you deserve to know what actually happened, if you're willing to hear it. I stared at the message for a long time before typing anything. Then I wrote one word. Yes. What came next arrived in pieces over the following hour. Marcus typed long, careful paragraphs, like he'd rehearsed this conversation in his head more than once but still couldn't quite find the right way to say it. He and Vanessa had been together for 2 years. They'd lived together for the last 8 months in an apartment in Boulder. This wasn't the story Ethan had told me. Vanessa hadn't been a freshly single woman who rediscovered an old flame because she was lonely. She had been in a full, current relationship, one that had slowly started falling apart in ways Marcus hadn't understood until it was too late. According to him, everything began around the same week Vanessa emailed Ethan. Marcus remembered the date because it was the week of his cousin's wedding. Vanessa had begged off the trip at the last minute, claiming she had a work deadline. After that, he noticed small changes. Her phone had a new passcode instead of the fingerprint she'd used for 2 years. She started taking calls in the bathroom with the fan running. He didn't accuse her of anything. Not at first. 2 years of trust doesn't collapse over a hunch. Then, in April, Vanessa told him she was pregnant. He'd been thrilled. Genuinely thrilled. Until the math started bothering him. Like any nervous father-to-be, he counted backward from the due date. The date he reached fell directly within a 10-day period when he now knew Vanessa had been seeing someone else. He had eventually checked. During those 10 days, she'd met Ethan for coffee twice and exchanged messages with him that started out nostalgic and quickly became something much less innocent. Marcus confronted her 3 weeks earlier. She hadn't denied it. Instead, according to Marcus, she told him she'd never intended for anything with Ethan to become serious. Ethan was simply something familiar she could lean on while things with Marcus felt unstable. She told Marcus that she loved him. Vanessa told Marcus the baby was his. She also told him Ethan didn't matter and never had. Marcus didn't believe that last part. He quietly started looking for answers, the way people do when trust turns into something closer to detective work. He found enough screenshots Vanessa hadn't completely deleted. Then he found a jewelry store receipt dated the same week she'd told Ethan she wasn't ready to define their relationship. That was enough for him to understand that whatever Vanessa had been telling each man privately, she'd been keeping both doors open at the same time, waiting to see which one led somewhere better. I have a paternity test scheduled for next week, Marcus wrote. I honestly don't think there's much doubt. I loved her enough to want to be wrong about all of this, and I still don't think I am. He continued. I found your name through a mutual friend after I saw Ethan's number saved in her phone under a name that wasn't his. I don't know what he's told you, but I don't think you should carry any of this like it's your fault. I read that last line 4 times. Everything rearranged itself in my mind as I sat there on my bed with the lamp still on, the coffee that had turned into a stranger sleeping 15 feet away from me within 3 weeks. The way Ethan flinched when I hugged him. The phone suddenly being flipped face down. None of it had been about a man rediscovering a lost love. Ethan had been auditioning an escape route while Vanessa was auditioning 2 men at the same time, keeping whichever option seemed more likely to work. And the thing that had been eating Ethan alive for the last 2 weeks, the thing that had him pounding on my door at midnight, wasn't heartbreak over losing Vanessa. It was panic. Vanessa was pregnant, Marcus believed the baby was his, and Marcus had finally found proof of what she'd been doing. Ethan had walked away from an engagement, a wedding, a family that loved him, and 3 years of a real life for a woman who had never actually left anyone for him. When Marcus's door finally closed on Vanessa, Ethan had nowhere left to go except the one place he'd already burned down behind him. I thought about that detail from weeks earlier, the one I'd almost ignored. Vanessa had been blowing him off during that first week, supposedly because of drama with an ex named Marcus. Ethan had told me that himself in a voicemail, almost distracted, without realizing what he was confirming. Marcus hadn't been some old ex causing petty drama. He had been Vanessa's actual boyfriend the entire time, right up until he wasn't anymore. Before we finished talking that night, Marcus sent me one more thing. It was almost an afterthought, like he debated whether to include it but ultimately decided I deserved the full truth instead of a softened version. It was a screenshot timestamped from the same week Ethan had contacted Vanessa. The message was from Vanessa to a friend named Priya. Not my Priya, just someone with the same name. It said, ***, having coffee with my ex tomorrow, LOL. Just seeing if the spark is still there. Backup plan just in case things with them fall apart. ***, 3 weeks later, almost to the day, things with them had fallen apart. And that backup plan had been sitting in my apartment, learning to flinch whenever I hugged him. I didn't cry. That surprised me more than anything else that night. Instead, I felt something colder and steadier than grief. Clarity. I stared at the screenshot for a long time before I could make myself respond. I kept going back to those words in my head, almost expecting them to change if I looked at them long enough. They didn't. For 3 weeks, I'd believed I was grieving a love story that had gone wrong, a man who had simply chosen someone else. But I was actually grieving something smaller and much stranger. A man who had been quietly auditioning an exit for weeks, maybe even longer, waiting to see which door opened first. And I had never even known there was a competition. I hadn't been given the chance to compete because I hadn't known I was competing at all. I texted Marcus back. I thanked him. I told him I was sorry for what he'd been through too, and that none of this was his fault either. Then I placed my phone face down on the nightstand and stared for a long time at the wedding dress hanging in its plastic sleeve in the corner of my closet. For the first time, I knew exactly what I was going to say to Ethan the next time he stood outside my door. He didn't make me wait long. The following evening, Friday at 7 o'clock, my buzzer rang. It was an hour I'd half expected because it was the time Ethan and I used to order takeout and watch terrible reality television back when our apartment still felt like a home instead of a crime scene I hadn't finished cleaning. I looked at the small screen beside the door. It wasn't just Ethan this time. Mia stood beside him, arms crossed and jaw tight. She clearly wasn't there because Ethan had invited her. And Eleanor stood one step behind them, leaning on her cane. At 74 years old, she had apparently decided she wasn't going to be left out of whatever was about to happen. I buzzed all 3 of them upstairs. Not because I owed Ethan anything, but because I finally had something I wanted witnessed. Ethan looked worse than I expected. 2 weeks of this had hollowed him out. Dark circles under his eyes. A wrinkled shirt that used to be pressed every morning without fail. Some old part of me, the part that had loved him for 3 real years, ached when I saw him like that. I let that part feel whatever it needed to feel. But I didn't let it make my decisions. "Thank you for opening the door," Ethan said, stepping forward like he expected an embrace, or at least some kind of truce. "I'm not opening it for you," I said. "I'm opening it because Mia and Eleanor deserve to hear this too, and because you deserve to hear it in front of them." His expression changed. Uncertainty replaced hope. "Hear what?" "I talked to Marcus last night." The color drained from Ethan's face so quickly that Mia actually reached out and touched his arm. It was an old instinct, his sister checking on her brother before remembering that she was furious with him. Eleanor didn't move. She simply watched him, the way you watch someone you're finally seeing clearly for the first time. "Who's Marcus?" Mia asked, looking between us. "Vanessa's boyfriend," I said. They were together for 2 years, and she was still living with him when she emailed Ethan in March. I continued before Ethan could interrupt. "According to Marcus, and according to the paternity test he's already scheduled, he believes the baby is his. He also found receipts and screenshots that showed exactly what Vanessa had been doing." I kept my voice level. I'd practiced what I wanted to say in the mirror that morning, and I was grateful I had. Being calm was the only way I was going to get through the next 5 minutes. "You didn't lose the love of your life because fate brought you back together," I told Ethan. "You were a backup plan. You were what Vanessa kept in her pocket in case Marcus ever found out what she was doing." I paused. "And the second Marcus found out and left her, you were all she had left, until you showed up here with nothing because you'd already burned down the only real thing you had." "That's not," Ethan started, then stopped. There was nowhere for the sentence to go. I watched him consider 3 different explanations and abandon all 3. "I have proof," he said instead, weaker now. He reached for his phone like it might still save him. "Screenshots. Timeline stuff. I was going to show you." "I don't need your proof." I looked directly at him. "I have Marcus's." Eleanor spoke for the first time since she'd walked in. Her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, which somehow made every word hit harder than shouting ever could. "You sat at my kitchen table and cried about how unfair Claire was being," she said to her grandson. "You let me believe you were the one who had been wronged this entire time." She stared at him. "You knew exactly what you'd done." "Grandma, it's complicated." "It is not complicated." Her voice remained calm. "It is very, very simple. You had someone who loved you honestly, and you traded her for a woman who was lying to two men at once." She shook her head. "And now you're standing in a hallway trying to convince the honest one to take you back because the dishonest one doesn't want you anymore." Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in 3 weeks, I watched him realize that nobody in that room was going to give him the story he needed. "I loved you," he said to me. His voice was quieter now, almost pleading. "That part was real. I swear to you, that part was real." "Maybe it was," I said, "and I meant it. That surprised even me. But loving someone and choosing them every single day aren't the same thing." I looked at him. "You stopped choosing me the moment something familiar and easy walked back into your life." I took a breath. "I don't think you left because you loved her more. I think you left because loving me actually required something from you, while loving the idea of her required nothing at all. It felt good right up until it stopped." I looked at Mia, then Eleanor, and finally back at Ethan. "I need you to hear this clearly because I'm only going to say it once." I paused. "I'm not angry anymore. I'm not confused anymore. I don't need an apology, and I don't need you to explain yourself, because none of it changes what already happened." My voice stayed steady. "You don't get to come back from this." Ethan stared at me. "Not because I'm punishing you. It's because there's nothing left here for you to come back to." He stood there for a long moment. Then something in his face finally cracked open into something that looked almost like recognition. Not recognition of what he'd lost, I don't think. More like recognition that there was truly no version of that night where he was going to get what he'd come for. "Okay," he finally said. So quietly, I almost missed it. Then he turned and walked back down the hallway alone. Mia stayed for another 20 minutes. She sat with me on the couch while I finally allowed myself to shake. Eleanor stayed even longer. She held my hand the way she'd held it 100 times before while we sat together over a shared skein of yarn. She didn't say anything else about her grandson. She just stayed. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it. That Ethan disappeared quietly and allowed the rest of the unraveling to happen in peace. It wasn't. And he didn't. Grief, especially the kind that comes with humiliation, rarely leaves people gracefully. 9 days later, on a Monday, Ethan showed up at Foothills Rehab. I was in the therapy gym, walking a patient through resistance exercises, when one of the front desk staff called back to warn me before Ethan even made it past reception. I had 30 seconds to decide how I wanted this to go. I chose calm. I finished setting my patient up with his resistance bands, excused myself, and met Ethan in the lobby. I wasn't going to let him come any farther into a place that had nothing to do with him. "I just want 5 minutes," he said. I could hear the rawness in his voice. This didn't feel like another performance. Not entirely. This was a man watching the last exit close. "You can't be here," I said. "This is my job. It's the one place in my life you haven't already made harder, and I need you to leave it that way." "Vanessa isn't answering my calls," he said. The words sounded like they'd been building pressure behind his teeth for days before finally breaking through. "Marcus is telling everyone I knew what I was doing. My own co-workers are looking at me differently. I don't have anywhere." "I know," I said, and I did feel something for him in that moment. Something smaller and sadder than pity. It was closer to recognizing someone in the middle of a collapse. "But it isn't my job to catch you." I looked at him. "It was never going to be my job to catch you, even if none of this had happened, because that's not what a marriage is supposed to be. One person shouldn't have to constantly absorb the other person's mistakes." Security walked him out 5 minutes later. They weren't rough with him, just firm. It was a manager's decision after word spread through the building that a man was refusing to leave the lobby. I watched through the glass doors as Ethan stood in the parking lot for a long moment before finally getting into his car. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with the walk I still had to finish with Mr. Alvarez. A few days after the incident at Foothills, I received an unexpected message. From Dale. Of all people. The same friend who had helped Ethan load his boxes into a pickup truck the day everything started. I almost didn't open it. I expected another round of the same coach sympathy I'd gotten from the college friends weeks earlier. Instead, the message was short, and it didn't ask me for anything. I helped him move his stuff out that day, and I want you to know I didn't know the full story then. He told me you two were already basically broken up before Vanessa. I know now that wasn't true. I'm sorry I was part of moving those boxes. I don't need anything from you. I just needed to say that. I read it twice. I was surprised by how much it mattered. There was something about that small, unnecessary honesty from someone who didn't owe me anything. I never replied with more than thank you. But I kept the message. Sometimes you need small proof that most people eventually want to be honest more than they want to be comfortable. The logistics took longer to untangle than the relationship had taken to fall apart. In its own bitter way, that felt like a fitting joke. The barn in Golden kept the entire $4,200 deposit. There was no clause for a groom deciding 6 weeks before the wedding that his past mattered more than the future he'd already committed to. The photographer refunded half of her deposit out of what she called professional sympathy. I appreciated the gesture more than the money itself. The caterer refunded nothing, citing a policy I should have read more carefully back when contracts felt like ordinary paperwork instead of prophecy. Bella Rosa Bridal took the dress back on consignment because it had never been worn. I stood inside the shop while the owner hung it back on the rack among other people's futures. I tried not to watch it disappear into the rows of dresses. The lease became its own small war. Ethan's name remained on it whether either of us liked it or not, at least until the term ended in August. That meant 6 more weeks of being legally tied to a man I never wanted to speak to again. His attorney, because apparently things had become formal enough for attorneys, sent me a letter claiming I owed Ethan half of the security deposit, regardless of who had broken what. My own attorney, a friend of Priya's who took the case at a rate I could actually afford, sent back a response citing the police incident reports, the changed locks, and the disturbance at my workplace. The request quietly disappeared after that. The ring came up exactly once. It was in a formal email from Ethan's attorney asking whether I intended to return it, since Colorado treats an engagement ring as a conditional gift. Apparently, he was prepared to litigate over a $6,200 ring if I refused. I mailed it back the next morning. Insured. Signature required. No note. I didn't need the money. I didn't need the ring. I needed it off my finger and out of my apartment. It was a small, cold circle of gold that had meant one thing in March and something completely different by May. Months later, Eleanor offered, half joking and half serious, to buy me a replacement out of spite. Something bigger. Something expensive. Just so she could see the look on her grandson's face. I told Eleanor I didn't want a ring from anyone right now. Not even from her. She smiled and said that was probably the healthiest thing I'd said all year. There was still the matter of all the furniture we'd bought together. The couch. The dining table Ethan's father had helped us assemble. The bed frame neither of us wanted anymore, for reasons that had nothing to do with money. In the end, I paid Ethan $800 for his half of everything just so we could stop negotiating over objects that no longer meant what they used to. It felt less like a settlement and more like buying back the right to stop discussing him entirely. By July, that was worth far more to me than $800. Vanessa never contacted me directly. Not once. I still heard about her secondhand for months through the strange little network that forms after something like this. She briefly posted about being a single mother abandoned by cowards, with a vague caption that could have been aimed at either man depending on which comment section you believed. Marcus sent me one final message before we both stopped having any reason to talk. The paternity test had come back exactly as he'd expected. He was paying child support. He wasn't sending Vanessa anything else. But before any of the legal mess was completely untangled, there was another, smaller and more exhausting task waiting for me. I had to tell 140 people that the wedding wasn't happening. I'd created a spreadsheet in February, cheerful and color-coded, tracking RSVPs, meal preferences, and hotel blocks for out-of-town guests. In May, I opened that same spreadsheet and had to turn it into something completely different. With Carol's help, I split the guest list roughly in half because Ethan had stopped answering calls from his own relatives by then. He was either too ashamed or too avoidant to say the words himself. I wrote one version of the message for people close enough to deserve the truth. For distant cousins and former co-workers, I wrote a shorter, vaguer version that didn't include details they didn't need. Aunt Robin, from Ethan's side of the family, called me crying. Not because of the wedding, she said. I just genuinely believed that after 50 years of watching family weddings come and go, ours was one of the good ones. A groomsman I had never particularly liked sent me 3 words that made me laugh for the first time in weeks. Asterisk, asterisk, he doesn't deserve you. Asterisk, asterisk, I wasn't sure I believed that yet. Not completely, but it helped hearing it from someone who had absolutely no reason to flatter me. Word reached Vantage Analytics too. The way these things always do, filtered through whichever coworker knew whichever mutual friend. Weeks later, during one of the few civil conversations Ethan and I had left, purely about the lease paperwork, he told me the story had made its way around his office. And it wasn't nearly as flattering as the version he'd posted in the group chat. A junior colleague he used to mentor stopped asking him to lunch. A promotion he'd been pursuing since January quietly went to someone else that summer. I never confirmed whether the two things were connected, but I noticed Ethan stopped mentioning the promotion entirely after June. I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have expected. I just saw it as another part of his life that had gotten smaller because of a decision he'd made in March. A decision he'd made standing in a coffee shop with a woman who had already decided, whether he knew it or not, that he was nothing more than a fallback. Ethan's family made their choice in the weeks that followed. Quietly, without ceremony, the way real loyalty usually shows itself. Carol still texted me on my birthday that year. Her message was simple. I hope this year is kinder to you. I think about it often. Mia and I had dinner every few weeks throughout the summer. Neither of us ever had to say it out loud, but our friendship had never belonged to her brother's relationship in the first place. Eleanor kept teaching me to knit on Saturdays. We never once discussed stopping. It was as if the tradition had quietly become bigger than the reason we'd started it. Near the end of July, I heard that Ethan had moved back in with his parents. I also heard that he and Vanessa hadn't spoken since Marcus's paternity results became known, at least within whatever small circle still cared enough to gossip about it. I heard, though I never confirmed it myself, that Ethan had started therapy. I hoped it was true. Not because I wanted anything from him anymore, but because I didn't actually want him to spend the rest of his life that hollowed out. Wanting someone to grow isn't the same as wanting them back. It took me a while to understand the difference. Then came one night near the end of June. It was exactly 1 week after what would have been our wedding date. That was when the grief finally arrived in full. Not in the manageable, functional pieces I'd been rationing it out in. I sat on my bedroom floor with the box from Bella Rosa Bridal beside me, the consignment paperwork still folded inside. And I let myself cry for the version of that day I never got to have. Not specifically for Ethan. Not even for the wedding itself. Not the flowers. Not the barn. Not the $4,200 that disappeared into nothing. I cried for the version of him I'd fallen in love with 3 years earlier at that barbecue in Washington Park. The man who used to leave his phone face up on the counter. The man who might have existed exactly as I remembered him. Or maybe he'd only ever been a story I'd been telling myself. I never got an answer to that question. I'm not sure I ever will. Around 10 that night, Mia showed up without asking first. Eleanor had told her the date had passed, and Mia had correctly guessed that I probably shouldn't be alone with it. She didn't say much. She sat on my bedroom floor with me, still wearing her scrubs after a 12-hour shift, and started looking through old photos on my phone without asking. The way only real family does. She stopped at one from that barbecue 3 years earlier. Ethan was mid-laugh, and I was still slightly choking on that rib bone. We were both looking at the camera like nothing bad had ever happened to either of us yet. You can grieve him and still know you're better off, she said, handing my phone back. Those aren't opposites. People just talk about them like they are. I thought about that for a long time after she left. It's still the truest thing anyone said to me that entire year. I let myself have that one full night. The next morning, I packed the paperwork into a drawer, made coffee, and went back to work. It's been a little over a year now. I moved out of Cherry Creek Lofts the day the lease finally ended and into a one-bedroom apartment near Sloan's Lake. I chose the place entirely by myself. My landlord has never heard Ethan Mercer's name and never will. I picked the paint colors alone, hung the artwork alone, Even put together a bookshelf from a box with instructions written in 4 languages and no help from anyone. There was a strange kind of quiet pride in that first weekend. The specific satisfaction of having a life that finally answered only to me. Last spring, I got promoted at Foothills. Now I run the outpatient program instead of simply working in it. The hours are longer, and I'm tired in a completely different way. But it's a kind of tiredness I chose for myself. I still knit with Eleanor most Saturdays. We don't talk about Ethan much anymore. Not because we're avoiding him. There's simply less and less that needs to be said. Mia got engaged this spring to a man who leaves his phone face up on the counter. She asked me to be there when she picks out her wedding dress. I said yes before she even finished asking. I still think about that night sometimes. The pounding on the door. The message glowing on my screen. The strange feeling of standing on one side of a door while someone you used to love was falling apart on the other. For a long time, I thought the lesson of that night was about Ethan. About weak men and old flames. About how easily 3 years can be traded for 3 weeks of nostalgia. I don't think that anymore. I think the real lesson was smaller. And harder. It took me a year before I could finally say it plainly. History isn't the same thing as love. Someone knowing you at 15 doesn't automatically mean they know you at 30. Comfort isn't the same thing as commitment. And an old memory will always feel easier than the daily, unglamorous work of choosing someone over and over again. At least until that memory turns out to have been carrying its own weight the entire time. You just couldn't see it. Ethan didn't leave me for Vanessa. He left me for an idea of himself that required no effort to maintain. And that idea collapsed the moment it had to deal with an actual person with actual problems of her own. I don't hate him anymore. That surprised me too. The anger faded more slowly than I expected. And then somehow, all at once. That's how most real healing seems to work. I hope he's built something honest out of whatever remains of his life. I hope, for his sake as much as mine, that the next person he loves gets the version of him who stays and shows up instead of the version who walks away the second something easier comes along. I just know it won't be me who finds out. And I've made peace with that. It's like making peace with a door you close yourself. You don't reach for the handle anymore. Not even out of habit. I've also thought a lot about Vanessa. It's easy to make her the villain in this entire story. The woman who juggled 2 men and blew up both their lives just to see which one landed softer. Some days, I still think that's exactly what she was. But I also try to remember that I only ever knew her through the wreckage she left behind. Through Marcus's grief. Through Ethan's panic. Never through a single word from her directly. Maybe there's another version of this story where she's not a villain at all. Maybe she's simply someone who was terrified of choosing wrong. Just like the rest of us. Except she handled that fear in a way that ended up hurting 3 people instead of 1. I don't forgive her exactly. I'm not even sure forgiveness is something I owe to someone I never actually met. But I've stopped needing her to be a monster for my own story to make sense. Ethan made his choices with his own 2 hands. And eventually, so did I. I stopped waiting for an explanation that would finally satisfy me and started building a life that didn't need one. Some nights, I still remember the sound of his fist against that door. The way he kept knocking, completely certain that if he just kept going long enough, I'd eventually have no choice but to open it. Now I understand that certainty was part of the problem. With him, and maybe with the version of me who loved him, too. He was certain the door would open because it always had before. I had to become someone new to prove to both of us that it wouldn't. Becoming that woman cost me more than I ever expected. A deposit I'll never get back. 140 phone calls I never wanted to make. A father I found again, and nearly lost again, in the same season. And a grandmother's Saturday afternoons that quietly became one of the strongest, steadiest things in my entire life. I don't say any of that for sympathy. I say that because I think people deserve to know that the version of you who finally closes the door doesn't come for free. She costs something, but she's worth it anyway. The wedding I had planned for June 21st never happened. But in a strange, smaller way, I got married that day anyway. Not to another person. To the version of my own life that I was finally allowed to choose instead of simply inherit. I don't know if that's what you'd call a happy ending. Maybe it isn't. I think it's just an honest one. And after everything that happened, honest felt like enough. He disappeared into the arms of his high school sweetheart just weeks before our wedding. Then, months later, He came pounding on my door at midnight, screaming about a baby that wasn't his. What he never understood, standing outside in the rain that night, was that I'd already closed the only door that truly mattered. Not the door to my apartment. The door to the version of me who still believed he was the man he claimed to be. That door doesn't have a lock anyone can pick. Not with an old key. Not with an old memory. Not even with a name from 15 years ago. I built that door myself from everything I had finally learned, everything I'd survived, and everything I had finally understood. And once I closed it, it stayed closed. Forever.